Leonardo da Vinci was one heck of a man. He's perhaps one of the greatest geniuses to ever exist. He discovered the laws of motion more than 100 years before Newton. He figured the earth revolved around the sun and not the other way around the same time as Nicholas Copernicus. He described Bernoulli's principle years before Bernoulli. For those of y'all who don't know what Bernoulli's principle is, it's this fundamental principle of fluid which explains how birds and planes fly. His achievements don't stop there. He was also the first person to depict our sinuses accurately, and his dental diagrams are so accurate, they even have all the nerves and everything, that he can be considered the father of dentistry. But calling him that would be an insult, because he did so much more, like I've mentioned before. And he also did paint the world's most famous painting, the Mona Lisa. Leonardo was an artist, a scientist, and an architect. Leonardo was the Renaissance man. So today we'll look at what made Leonardo da Vinci Leonardo da Vinci. We'll look at how he became the genius he is and some lessons we can take away from him. If we are to understand Leonardo da Vinci, we need to look at his childhood because that hugely shaped him. Leonardo was born in wedlock, illegitimate, literally a bastard. It made him who he was. It resulted in him being a part of the family, but not fully, and so this forced him to be more independent, more adventurous, more improvisational. It also allowed him to skip formal education. He didn't need to attend Latin school. And he prided himself in this lack of formal education. He described himself as a disciple of experience and scoffed at these people who would learn things primarily through reading. His method relied on experimenting, curiosity, and finding wonder in things most people don't pay attention to. Though later on in his life, he did accept the importance of reading and learning things from books. But I think there's something we can learn here. Even today's education system focuses way too much on learning through books rather than learning from experience. And so if we were to develop a little bit more Leonardo in us, we should be learning from experience and experimenting with things ourselves. Another thing, he came from a family of notaries, from which he acquired the habit of noting things down, and this led to his world-famous journals. If he were not born in a family of notaries, he probably would not have started journaling, and he probably would not have become the great man he is today. I think it's also important to look at the time and place he was born in, because he was born in Florence, which was the concentration of geniuses at that time. In Florence, Leonardo came across Machiavelli, who was this dark philosopher and military strategist. In fact, Joseph Stalin's strategy was developed after reading Machiavelli. His rival Michelangelo, who was also the painter of Sistine Chapel, also came from Florence. And even the painter Raphael came from Florence. In fact, Raphael was the student of Leonardo da Vinci. Leonardo was also born the same year Gutenberg opened his publishing house, and he was born a year apart from Vespucci and Christopher Columbus. So he was born in this time where the printing revolution was taking place. He was born at the beginning of the age of exploration, during the age of exploration, and it was also the time the Ottoman Turks were invading Constantinople. So all the Constantinople scholars moved in from there to Florence, and they carried along with them the manuscripts and the wisdom of Aristotle, Plato, and Ptolemy. And if we look at Florence, it was also the melting pot of all sorts of creative people. Artists, silk workers, wood carvers, goldsmiths, etc. It was the most literate city in Europe at the time and was a center of trade and commerce with the largest banks. All of these factors directly or indirectly played a part in Leonardo's genius. Now, my biggest lesson from Leonardo da Vinci has to be don't compartmentalize knowledge. Steve Jobs commented on Leonardo da Vinci and said, Leonardo saw beauty in both art and engineering, and his ability to combine them was what made him a genius. Now, Jobs himself was a man who was at the intersection of art and technology, and that's what made him a genius. And so it's this theme of combining two different fields which leads to something unique is something we can learn from Leonardo. And if we look at Leonardo's diary journals, we'll see he had drawings of water eddies, and his biographer, Walter Isaacson, asked an art curator if Leonardo considered them as a work of art or a work of science. To which the art curator replied, I don't think Leonardo would have even made that distinction. Boom, that's my biggest lesson from Leonardo. Everything is connected to everything. Don't isolate knowledge. It prevents you from making novel connections. Don't limit your interests to one field. Don't think of things as separate fields. Don't consider yourself good at one field and bad at another. Don't limit yourself to your specialization. If we look at his great paintings, they were not only a result of his marvelous painting skills, but also his knowledge of anatomy, optics, and geology. So combine different fields and great things happen. Another thing to look at is Leonardo's curiosity. Leonardo was exploring the wild when he came across a cave. It was dark and he couldn't see inside it. And so he had two conflicting choices. He could stay safe, ignore the cave and move on, or he could take the risk, go into the cave and find out what's in it. We all know what Leonardo did. Of course he chose to explore the cave, because he always chose to satisfy his curiosity above all else. And it ended up rewarding him, because what he found was a whale fossil. Leonardo was the most relentlessly curious man in history, the historian Kenneth Clark noted, and I think we all can agree. His habit of noting things down and curiosity also led to his interesting to-do lists, and his to-do lists weren't exactly day-to-day task productivity, to-do list kind of thing. It was more of noting things down which he wanted to observe, or noting things down he wanted to learn about. So I'll just read out some of his observations, some of his to-do list pointers. Observe the goose's foot. If it were always open or always closed, the creature wouldn't be able to make any movement. Why is the fish in the water swifter than the bird in the air, when it ought to be the contrary, since water is thicker and heavier than air? Describe the tongue of the woodpecker. And my favorite of them all has to be, go every Saturday to the hot bath, where you will see naked men. He even had a bunch of short questions like, what makes a face beautiful? Why is the sky blue? What effect does light have on the sky? Why do people yawn? And so one actionable thing we can do is, when a random question comes into our mind, we can just note it down on our phones, or in a notebook, and look at them later and actually go deep into these questions. Because something I find myself doing is, a question will come to my mind and I'll be like, why is this the way it is? And I'll probably ask a friend or a person next to me, why do you think this is the way it is? And most of the time both of us don't know the answer for that, and then I just forget the question and I move on with my life. But I think I could learn a lot more if I just wrote down a question which popped in my mind, and later go back when I'm free and actually find out the answer to that question, I think my life would truly change. Now, coming to his observational skills, it would be an understatement to say Leonardo was a master of observation. As seen in his to do lists, he would observe the most random things, like the tongue of a woodpecker. And the tongue of the woodpecker is more significant and cooler than you think. It's the tongue of the woodpecker is 3 times its bill length, and it folds around its skull till its nostril. And the woodpecker's head also has to face 10 times the pressure while, pecking, and this pressure is enough to kill a human. Now, the only reason this tinier creature can survive all this, pressure is because of its tongue. And now maybe Leonardo didn't know all of this about the woodpecker's tongue, but the fact that he even cared to observe the woodpecker's tongue is something interesting, because how many of us actually care to look at a bird and wonder what its tongue does, what its tongue is like? And Leonardo describes his method of observing, which I'll read out to you. Seeing a page of a book is useless. You need to read it word by word to understand what it's saying. Similarly, when you observe something, notice one detail at a time and move on only once you've gotten the first detail in your head. That's a really simple method but effective one, which I really need to try out. I really need to do more. Now, Leonardo was gay. Don't copy everything from him. Not to make this a modern Disney movie with a mandatory gay character, but there's good reason to believe why Leonardo was gay. So was his rival Michelangelo. There's a theory that says gay people are more likely to be gifted. It's evolution's way of reducing sexual competition while still helping the species progress forward by giving gay people natural genius. And I'm starting to see more merit to this theory. Apart from these two people, Oscar Wilde, Alan Turing, Sam Altman, Peter Thiel, Yuval Noah Harari, all these people are/were gay. But that's besides the point. He and Michelangelo were opposites in many ways. Leonardo was more outgoing and socially loved, while Davinci was more of a naturalist who refused to believe the church dogma, while Michelangelo was fervently religious. They also had opposite styles of painting. Leonardo preferred smoother, sfumato painting with smooth shadows and blurred lines, while Michelangelo preferred sharp cutout outlines. The lesson is, you don't have to copy everything from a great person to be great. Two of the greatest painters of their time, and perhaps ever in history, had many contradicting habits. One was really social, one was not very social, one was religious, and the other was not really religious. The lesson is, you don't have to copy everything from a great person to be great. Different things work for different people. Michelangelo and Da Vinci, some of the greatest painters of their time, and so this is how the two greatest artists in history were opposites in many ways. Now, I'd like to lastly touch upon the paradox of Leonardo. Leonardo was a huge procrastinator. On some days, he would spend hours just looking at one of his paintings and just leave after adding a few strokes. The majority of his projects were left unfinished, and it drove his patrons nuts. It even later prevented him from getting commissions, because nobody wanted to pay Leonardo to do something because they were not even sure if he would finish doing it. And maybe this is what made him a creative genius instead of just a reliable craftsperson. Leonardo was also good at everything, as I've mentioned before. Still, he couldn't do long division, and he never managed to learn Latin despite trying, which is interesting. He advocated solitude and going to the countryside to paint alone. At the same time, he lived most of his life in the most happening cities, usually surrounded by his students, patrons, and people, which is another interesting thing. He also didn't change the world despite his crazy list of discoveries, right? It's because most of his journals were discovered decades or even centuries later. And by the time this happened, his discoveries weren't all that new. And, that's why sharing ideas is important, something Leonardo didn't focus that much on. But it didn't diminish his genius nonetheless. And we can only learn from him today because he wrote things on physical paper. So if you want your bloodline to learn from you, write on paper. Everything digital is probably gonna disappear. And that's it for this video podcast speaking thing. I don't know. See ya, guys.